everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to get started again. Okay, everybody, we are going to get started with the next segment of our agenda. If you can all take your seats, we are going to start with our next discussion. Okay, welcome back. I hear a lot of chatter. That's really nice to hear. I hope you're all finding this a good opportunity to meet with those you know and to meet some new people. I'm not going to lie, curiosity killed the cat, and I went upstairs. I wanted to see what all the action was about, and I realized as I exited the doors that I might not be able to get back in. So watch for that over the lunch hour. If you decide to leave, your badge is like gold, so don't lose that. So with that, our next speaker is Dr. Kathleen Spees. She is a principal at the Brattle Group with expertise in wholesale electricity and environmental policy design and analysis. Her work for market operators, regulators, regulated utilities, and market participants focuses on energy, capacity, and ancillary service market design, the design of carbon and environmental policies, evaluation of traditional and emerging technology assets, and strategic planning in the face of industry disruption. Dr. Spees has worked in more than a dozen international jurisdictions supporting the design and enhancement of environmental policies in wholesale power markets and decarbonizing electricity systems. This segment will delve into the ins and outs of how existing load-serving entities work in other jurisdictions and discuss issues that are emerging with their discussion today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spees.
Okay, now with that music, I'm actually really regretting these shoes a lot because I should have gotten it going. So this segment here is about load-serving entities, and I was excited to participate in this. Especially, I've had quite a few conversations with folks in Ontario about the load-serving entity model and what it could offer to Ontario. What does it mean in the current context? And there's really only one common theme that I can pick out from many of those conversations, which is a lot of people don't know what that is, and a lot of people do know what it is, but none of them agree with each other. So my job today is to try to offer a bit of a common understanding of what could a load-serving entity model be, and what could it be in Ontario. And I will, of course, reference the OEA and Power Advisory paper on this subject as well. So with that, let me get into it. One other thing I want to mention at the outset is, given the broader context of today, we're talking about distributed energy resources and all of the exciting opportunities that we can pursue to get customers more engaged and enabled and distributed resources in this sector. That's a very interlinked and interrelated topic to load-serving entities, but in some ways these are separable discussions up to a certain point. The discussion of what is an LSE, I think, at least for the purposes of this initial kind of level setting presentation, can be largely separated from the question of how do we enable distributed energy resources. They're very related, but they're at least partly separable, and that's how I'm going to approach this for at least part of the talk today. Okay. So yeah, basically going through a few questions from my experience working in across the U.S. Markets, the different U.S. markets, quite a few international markets. What is an LSE? What does it mean? What benefits can you derive from moving to an LSE model, and then specifically applying that in the Ontario context? Okay. So the first and simplest answer is the load-serving entity is the entity that is assigned in settlements wholesale electricity market costs and then passes those costs on to an end-use customer. So that's a very simple answer, and it's also very generic. It's intentionally generic because this term is used in many, many markets, especially in the US markets, this term is used a lot. And in those markets, they really have to be thinking about a wide variety of different business models that can be represented by load-serving entities. And so the simplest possible definition is whoever it is that's settled the costs of operating the wholesale markets and then passes those costs on to the end-use customer. And so when I refer to an LSE, that's all I'm referring to, is it's whoever's absorbing those costs. And by that definition, of course, Ontario already has LSEs. There is somebody assigned these costs and who sends bills to the customers. Typically, we're talking about, in many jurisdictions, we're talking about the distribution company that's providing this function, but not exclusively. Okay, the full answer, the more complete answer, and this is where I'm going to spend quite a bit of time kind of laying out the many, many different things that people may have in mind when they're talking about load-serving entities. So the full answer is a load-serving entity can have a wide variety of different business models and relationships to the customer and different roles in the industry. And I'm going to go through each of these and then talk a little bit about how that works in the places where it's very common. So first of all, there's a pass-through LSE model. That's not exactly what we have in Ontario, but for the most part, that's what we have in Ontario. You take the wholesale market costs, you assign it to whoever is the entity that sends the bill to the end-use customer, and that's all they do. They just take that cost and send it right through to the customer. And so when the customer gets their bill, it's exactly the wholesale cost. Usually there's some translation of wholesale costs into retail costs. We'll talk more about that. But first and foremost, that's a very passive model. The LSE in this case doesn't offer any value add services to the customer. Really all they're doing is sending out that bill. The next version is a default service provider. Sometimes these are referred to as the provider of last resort. This model is very common in the US markets that have retail choice. So they have a competitive retail market. In many of these places, there's the competitive retail market, as well as, again, usually the distribution company, but not exclusively, is providing something that's a little bit more than a pass-through LSE. So rather than simply taking wholesale prices and then passing them to customers, they're doing a bit of hedging on behalf of customers. So there are usually a lot of rules typically done by the state regulatory commission that determine exactly the term, the duration, and the nature of this hedging that usually the distribution company can do on behalf of customers. In many of these markets, they have a restructured industry overall. So the investment side of the equation is privatized. That's done on a competitive basis, and so the distribution company or the default service provider is not engaged in that business. They're not doing individual long-term contracts. They're not doing self-supply, but they are allowed to do a bit of hedging for their customers. For example, they can do that through auctions for default service. What that looks like is they can set up a structured product and say, look, we have 100,000 customers. We're going to sell off every year the right to serve 10 to 20% of these customers on a laddered basis, say on 2 or 3 year contracts. And when you do these auctions, then different parties will come forward and offer that hedge to the default service provider. So you have a competitively procured bundle of service on behalf of customers, and it's for a specific term and duration, say 2 to 3 years usually. So how this ends up working in practice is most customers, especially for residential customers who are not actively choosing a different retail provider, will get this default service. They'll get a rate that's kind of hedged and locked in on a 2 to 3 year basis, but they're not really actively engaged in that procurement in any way. They're not individually expressing a preference for how that service is provided or how much hedging they want, but instead the default service provider is engaging in these very structured hedging opportunities and then passing that hedged price on to customers. Overall, the price ends up being pretty much the same as the wholesale price. As you can imagine, the competing providers of this service are pretty much pricing in the wholesale market prices, but doing it on a kind of an expected average basis. And then the primary advantage you're getting out of that is a bit of a hedge for the retail customers. Another model that can be covered by the LSE would be a vertically integrated utility. This is the model that is the predominant approach in U.S. markets, including the Southwest Power Pool and the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. In most of these states, there's one entity that is the distribution company, and then they also do integrated resource planning. They have either self-supply, they own a fleet of generation, or they procure through long-term contracts on behalf of their customers. So they're very engaged in basically resource supply planning, and they pass those costs on to their customers. This is more or less the model that OEA paper that I'm sure many of you are familiar with has discussed. Under that model, in Ontario, what it would look like is for those distribution companies that would opt to become, kind of an integrated utility type model, they would be doing resource planning functions. And so what that means in Ontario, of course, is, there is a history of integrated resource planning in Ontario. This has historically been done by the OPA and more recently by the IESO. What this would do in Ontario would be to shift the responsibility of integrated resource planning from the IESO to these distribution companies. And so practically, what could that mean? Integrated resource planning does offer things like, it does tend to be a pretty hedged model. You have somebody doing a complete plan as to all of the needs of their customers for all the products that they need. And then it flows through the wholesale market. Let me describe how that happens in places like SPP and MISO. What that means is, in MISO, a vertically integrated utility, the combination of these make sure that they decide what is the resource mix in the fleet, and then they really rely on the energy and ancillary services markets for operations and dispatch. So they get a lot of efficiency benefits out of the energy and ancillary services markets, but in these regions there's no in SPP there's no capacity market. There is a requirement that the utilities have a certain amount of capacity, but they don't have a capacity market. They don't feel that they need one. In MISO, they do have a capacity market, but it's really kind of an accounting. Mechanism. In that market, they don't rely on the capacity market to make investment decisions. The utilities are making those investment decisions, and so the capacity market is really just ensuring that everyone has completed that or fulfilled their capacity obligation. And then I guess bringing that to the Ontario context, what does that mean? I see that as a little bit of a departure from, or maybe a big departure from the market renewal initiative that we're all very familiar with. if applying that model in Ontario, I think what we'd see is that the efficiency benefits that we're expecting to get out of the energy and ancillary service market reforms would be achieved maybe in full, or at least in part, would be largely achieved. But the concept of the capacity market would be a departure from that. You'd be, again, relying on integrated resource planning to make supply decisions, and you really wouldn't be relying on the capacity market to enable competitive investments. So it would be, I think, quite a departure. Another model that is also an LSE model is a competitive retailer. Competitive retailers are those entities that will fight hard to get you as a customer and send you your bill. If you sign up for service through a competitive retailer, they may offer you a fixed rate for a few years. They may offer you full green, a full green bill. They may offer you a few different things to attract you as a customer and provide various value add services. And if they win you as a customer, then they are assigned the costs from the wholesale market on your behalf, and then they obviously send you your bill. Now, let's see. So that competitive retailer may or may not choose to do supply planning. Competitive retailers are often at least partly vertically integrated in terms of they may also own some generation. They may also contract with some generation. Especially if they're providing an all-green bill, they probably are contracting with some generation. And so in that way, they have certain similarities to the vertically integrated utility model in that they can procure at least part of the supply needs from their own portfolio. Those get efficiently dispatched in the wholesale market, and then they get assigned the net costs, which are passed to the customers. So they can do a bit of hedging in that way and offer fixed rates if the customers want that. But there's a really big and important distinction between competitive retailers and a vertically integrated utility, which is cost recovery. Competitive retailers have no guarantee that they're going to recover their costs. If they make an investment in a generation plant that's uneconomic, that turns out to be uneconomic 10 years down the road, they will lose money on that because most likely they're not going to find any customer that's going to lock in prices for 10 years. So if they build a plant that's uneconomic and above kind of market value, they're going to lose customers after, say, 2 or 3 years, and then they'll be holding the bag. They're taking on that risk that the market's not going to want what they have to offer. Whereas a vertically integrated utility, typically they're earning a guarantee through a regulatory approval process that if they make an investment in a plant and the plant turns out uneconomic, the customer is still going to be allocated the costs, and the utility will earn a return on that investment. So even though the actions or the role in the industry may be largely similar, there's a very big difference in terms of a vertically integrated utility not taking on merchant risk, typically, whereas a competitive retailer is taking on that risk. And you see, therefore, a very different approach to how the nature of the products they're going to offer to customers. And then a final version that is, I think, quite interesting in many US markets is the community choice aggregator. These are, just say, 5 to 10 states in the US that specifically enable this sort of a model. This community choice is about letting individual communities at the local level decide their own resource planning and their own mix. This is usually tied to going green. It's usually for cities that want to make sure that they have a 100% clean portfolio on behalf of their citizens or residents. And how that usually works is there will be some municipal authority or local government that makes the decision to go to a community choice model, and they procure that supply on behalf of their residents. Often there's an opt-out provision, so for customers that just want the cheapest price, that they don't have to participate. Okay. And then finally, what benefits do we expect to get out of load-serving entities? I did have a bit of a trouble populating this table. I'm sure there will be disagreement on how I chose to populate that. So the types of benefits that you could potentially achieve out of load-serving entities are on the left here, and then with each of those different models, do they or don't they achieve those benefits? I'm going to start with the bottom and then go up. First and foremost, I think if we start thinking about the load-serving entity question in Ontario, I think the first part of this is to be very focused on the customer, making sure that whatever path Ontario ultimately takes, that it's very much focused on letting customers express their wants and needs, letting customers express their desire for hedges. Do they want to hedge and get a 20 years locked-in price? Probably not. That's not how customers have typically expressed their preferences. At most customers are looking for 2 or 3 years, no more than 5 years. Even for a big company, they're typically not looking for hedges much longer than that. Green, lots of customers these days want to be green. So that should be something that, regardless of the LSE model, customers have that opportunity to express a desire for, very green power, and of course staying green. In Ontario, it's much more important to reflect the preference to stay green because Ontario is already so green, but in the future, likely that will erode a bit. And then the other thing is customer preferences. Historically, those have been the two areas that we're really talking about for customer preferences, is hedging and going green. But going forward, there's going to be a lot more that our sector can offer to customers. And this is where I think we really get into the conversation of the interaction between load-serving entities and distributed energy resources. Customers will increasingly have an appetite for value-add services. They'll have a different interest in how they receive their customer bill, how they get communicated, or a preference to let someone control the devices in their home, but not actually have to do anything actively on a day-to-day basis. They may choose to that. Some customers will have a different preference on privacy. A lot of times there are barriers to getting a lot of distributed energy resources and third-party providers in the mix because there's a concern about privacy. But some customers may not be as private about their energy use. So I think these types of preferences are going to be increasingly important as we try to enable different players in this space. And then I think I have a little bit more time. And then a couple other pieces that I want to hit on here. You'll see that some of these are green check marks. I mean, to that, I would say that benefit is more or less enabled by using this version of the LSE model. But a lot of these are kind of that red or yellow color. What that indicates is whether or not you can achieve these benefits depends a lot on implementation details. So when you get into something like enabling competitive retailers or using default service, the how it's implemented has as much to do with the success of achieving these benefits as which of the models you pick. And especially for distributed energy resources, this is 100% the case. And I think we'll get a lot into that in the next panel, which is there are a lot of things that you can do to prevent this sort of business activity from flourishing. There are a lot of steps in the value chain that can act as roadblocks and barriers to enabling creative and innovation in this space. And one or two examples of that. One is the customer bill. A lot of places have moved to retail choice, but the state has a rule that even though we have retail choice, the distribution company is still the entity that sends the customer their bill, which should certainly enable a third-party competitive retailer to provide hedge value and to provide green power. But what about that future of value-add services where the competitive retailer wants to do more than that? What if they want to change the mode of delivery of the bill? What if they want to change the mode of communication with the customer? If they don't have access to the primary data, if they don't have access to that billing infrastructure, if they don't have access to this on a real-time basis, that prevents a lot of business models that might otherwise be enabled. It doesn't let them use an app to send that bill to the customer. So a lot of these details really do end up as make or break choices. Couple of takeaways, and then I think I'll be out of time. So a couple of things to keep in mind for Ontario. First and foremost, when we talk about load-serving entities, we're really talking about something simple, which is who's assigned the costs of the wholesale market and acts on behalf of retail customers. But it can actually mean a wide variety of different business models. You can be talking about integrated resource planning. You can be talking about a really passive entity. You can be talking about a creative, competitive retailer that's doing a lot of customer engagement. We can really be talking about a lot of things. And I think we should be thinking about setting this kind of retail and customer space up in a way that you enable a wide variety of different business models. So the customers really have the ability to choose what they want. So that customers can choose electronic or paper billing, that they can choose whether or not they have devices, that they can choose their level of privacy, and that they can choose to act with an aggregator or more of a kind of a bundled service. Second is alignment with market renewal. I think that's so critical. What's happening with market renewal is we're getting taking a big step forward to get much, much more efficient pricing at every time scale, to get much more efficient pricing in the energy and ancillary service markets so that the supply side of the market knows how to react, knows how to operate on a 5-minute basis, on an hourly basis, on a day-ahead basis, and on an investment time scale, on a 3 to 4 years forward basis. These price signals are going to add a lot of value to the province. So I would hope that whenever we look at LSE models, we're also considering how do those align with the efficient prices that we're developing at the wholesale space. How do we make sure that those efficient prices are provided not only to the supply side, but also all the way to the end-use customer? That means the marginal choices to consume energy are the same for the customer as they are to produce that energy to the supplier. And what that will do is to help the customer say, no, we don't want that energy, it's too expensive. That, I think, is going to be increasingly important to get value out of the customer side of the market. And that's true at both the investment and operating time scales. And so, as I mentioned, if one of the main things we're trying to do with market renewal is to move away from contracts with a guaranteed rate of return toward competitive investments, many of these models are very, very consistent with that, but an integrated resource planning type model is not. It's much more what Ontario has been doing, even if you're shifting the burden of who's doing it. And then again, alignment with retail rates. We'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure, in the next panel, and enabling DERs and disruption. I think being very open-minded and broad thinking about the types of business models and devices that can be out there is really critical. But again, it's about enabling all of these different business models and sending those efficient price signals all the way. And I don't know if there's a minute for one question? Okay. Or comment?
Hi there, Ron Clark at Airden Burles, co-author with Power Advisory of the OEA paper. Thank you for your very good analysis and review of the different options for the for LSE models. Very useful. I wonder if you could go back to the benefits slide, perhaps. So it's interesting that under the competitive investments part, there's kind of a blank under the vertically integrated utility column. I think the authors of the paper would, I'm not sure it was intended that the LSE model that was discussed there be under a kind of vertically integrated utility description, because there was a specific discussion of regulated utilities procuring energy resources from either affiliates that would have ARC, affiliate relationships code type protections, or third-party service providers, and thus incenting competitive investment. So I think it would, as I say, surprising to the authors that it would be considered a vertically integrated utility model. But in light of that sort of approach, do you think there is scope to kind of check that box under competitive investment, under the vertically integrated utility box, considering it really doesn't fit within a vertically integrated utility descriptor?
Yeah, and I think this can be a very long conversation. I think it's an interesting one for us to have. So I guess in my view, when you're moving to an integrated resource plan model, that doesn't just mean one thing. And I think you've just laid that out. There are versions of that which are, a range from, really just utility self-supply and self-investment to all the way to, very competitive procurements. And even amongst the competitive procurements model, there's different layers of competition. Are you specifying the resource type, but then compete, and then the only competition is among gas combined cycle plants, and they all have to have a 20-year term? Or are you going further with competition and enabling a broader mix of resources? For example, you're just procuring capacity, and it's 5 years, but you're letting demand response compete with generation. So there's a big range of how competitive are those investments when you're talking about integrated resource planning. And I think if you flip all the way to one end of that, in the extreme, you're almost to where we are with the capacity market, where you're really just doing 1 year at a time. Every resource type can compete. And if you're all the way there, I think yes, you do check the box. I think the majority of the time when we're talking about resource planning is somewhere on the other end of the spectrum. So that's why I didn't check it.
Okay. Thanks for that.